So we are live, right?
Yes.
Okay. And everyone can hear me? Is that okay?
Hold on for a sec. We are about to go.
Yeah.
Yes, we are live now. Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Dushyant. So I'm audible, right, to all of you?
Yes.
Yes.
So I'm starting off with a quote, and it's from Kamala Sohani. She says that though Raman was a great scientist, he was very narrow-minded. I can never forget the way he treated me just because I was a woman. This was a great insult to me. The bias against women was so bad at that time. What can one expect if even a Nobel laureate behaves in such a manner? Those are the words of Kamala Sohani, and she describes the gender-based discrimination that she faced while trying to gain entry as a master student into Indian Institute of Science, one of the premier research institutes of our country. Kamala Sohani was born in 1911 in Indore, Madhya Pradesh. Her uncle and her father were both chemists, and she was focused in academics. She got a BSc degree in chemistry from Bombay University in 1933. She then applied for admission to the master's degree at the Indian Institute of Science. But she was rejected by the then director and Nobel laureate Sir C.V. Raman on the grounds that he did not consider women competent enough to pursue research. But Kamala fought against the gender-based discrimination and held a satyagraha in front of C.V. Raman's office, forcing him to budge and grant her MSc admission. But there remained certain clauses and restrictions that were sexist and humiliating. At the Indian Institute of Science, Kamala started working on proteins in milk, pulses, and legumes under the guidance of M. Srinivasaya. Her research work influenced Professor Raman's decision to allow more women to be admitted to the institution. Kamala went on to join UK's Cambridge University and worked under Dr. Derek Richter. Later, she joined Dr. Robin Hill's laboratory to work on plant tissues. During her work on potatoes, she discovered cytochrome C, which is a fundamental and universally conserved enzyme of the electron transport chain. After her PhD in 1939, Kamala returned to India, and she was appointed the professor and the head of the Department of Biochemistry at Lady Hardinge Medical College in New Delhi. Later, her work on nutritive properties of Neera, which is a sap extracted from the toddy palms, and its utility as a cost-effective dietary supplement for malnourished children and pregnant women, was greatly appreciated. Kamala was awarded a Rashtrapati Award for the work. She passed away in 1998. All her life, she was an ambassador of gender equality in the field of science and shattered several notions of gender bias all along her journey in the world of science. In honor of the woman who stood up to a powerful scientist and protested against gender bias in science, Biologically Speaking, in association with Bias Watch India, is very happy to present the Kamala Sohani panel on gender equity. If you're joining now, this session is part of a 2-day conference that celebrates women in research. It's called HerStory of Science. It is it's on the eve of International Women's Day 2021. And today we remember all those women and non-binary people of science, of academia, who like her resisted, raised their voice, and fought discrimination, stereotyping, oppression, and patriarchy. Today we remember the pioneers, the trailblazing Indian women of science, and the many hidden figures who were forgotten by history. To Kamala, Oshima, Veronica, Kadambini, and many, many more. We stand on their shoulders, we walk the path they showed us. As we remember them today, we remind ourselves how far we have come, how we got here, and also of the long road ahead to a more equitable world. Today, we have 4 amazing women who will talk to us about their work, their experiences, their perspectives, and their journeys. So I begin with Dr. Geeta Chadda, who is a sociologist from the University of Mumbai. And she has been teaching sociology for over a decade. She has taught sociology at undergraduate colleges in Mumbai University and on the international program of the University of London in Mumbai. She has designed and taught a first of its kind course in feminist science studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. She has designed innovative pedagogic initiatives for integrating science and social science teaching. Her research interest lies in science studies, feminist theories, cultural and post-colonial studies. She critiques the changing perspectives in India, and her recent volume of work is Feminists and Science: Critiques and Changing Perspectives in India, and is co-edited with Sumi Krishna and is published by Sri Shamya, Kolkata. She has developed frameworks for feminist archiving at the Research Center for Women's Studies, SNDT Women's University, Mumbai, India. I'll also introduce the other panelists before we move to Dr. Chadda for our first talk. Dr. Maya Saran is a mathematician from Ashoka University, Sonipat. She completed her bachelor's degree in mathematics from St. Stephen's College in Delhi. She worked in development alternatives, researching sustainable building materials for rural Indian communities. She earned her PhD in mathematics in 2011 at the University of Illinois, where she was recognized as an outstanding graduate instructor. Her specialty is mathematical logic. Nandita Jayaraj is the science writer, editor. She's a co-founder of the feminist science media platform, The Life of Science. She began this adventure with writer Ashima Freydog in 2015, and they chronicle the lives and the works of women scientists all over India. She has co-authored children's books like 31 Fantastic Adventures in Science, published by Penguin India. The Life of Science, they describe themselves as a science media platform that focuses on contemporary research in science and stories of scientific pursuit that intersect with the existing social barriers in our country. Suchita Champak is our co-panelist today. She's a science communicator and the founder of SciRio. Suchita is the founder and the managing editor of SciRio, which is a digital ecosystem for science communicators. She worked as a research associate at the Indian Institute of Science and Center for Human Genetics. Then she transitioned into communicating science. While working at such institutes, she realized that in India, we lack an ecosystem for funding, support, or infrastructure to nurture and support the development of science communication as a career form. Whereas this is present in countries like US, Germany, or European countries. So she founded SciRio, and this platform tries to establish a space where science communicators can support, network, and build an ecosystem, find appropriate training and resources. With that, I've introduced all our panelists. I would now ask Dr. Chadda to talk about her perspectives and the way she sees gender equity in today's world of science academia. Over to you, Dr. Chadda.
Thank you, Rupkatha. I'm delighted to be here, particularly since it is a conference of young scholars, and I believe young career people who are on their career paths, but who are young, I believe. And so delighted to be here because this is a difficult proposition to have a conversation with women practitioners of science and what feminist science studies involves. And Rupkatha wanted me to just lay down some of the foundations. I'm going to try. So Maya, Nandita, and Suchita, wonderful to be here with all three of you. And thank you by Swatch and Biological Speaking. And let me start by saying Kamala Sohni was at the Bombay University in 1933. I joined there 50 years later in 1983. There seems to be a connection. There seems to be also a connection in the fact that Raman was Tamil Brahmin and Kamala Sohni was a woman from North India. I wonder whether that also had something to do with the way she was treated by Raman. Let's ask some of these extremely difficult questions. I'm going to try and share screen. All right, so sociologically speaking, since we are doing biologically speaking, I thought let me play with that and do sociologically speaking, voicing feminisms in science. Yeah. So what is feminist science studies? So as Rupkatha wanted me to sort of put this out. It's a field of study built largely at the intersections of what is known as science studies, which is a field which brings philosophy, sociology, history, anthropology, psychology, and literature to bear upon science. So it's a multidisciplinary sort of domain. But more importantly, science studies is largely characterized by the fact that it was informed by social movements. So feminist science studies is at the intersection of science studies and what we know as women's studies. Some of you in some universities might know about this little field called women's studies, where we try to do all these disciplines from the perspective of women's life worlds, and we present critiques of these disciplines, arguing that these disciplines were largely constructed within very masculinist paradigms, and we suggest ways of looking at it alternatively. Yeah. So FSS looks at science from feminist perspective, which means simply it uses gender as a lens to look at science, which in turn would mean looking at patriarchy in science from the standpoint of women, but also other marginal groups too, because today's feminist politics and scholarship is deeply intersected. A technical term to some, but in the more common usage in a simple way, it simply means that we look at gender not just on a single axis framework, but we see it as it intersects with caste, with class, with sexuality, with ethnicity. So now what does FSS really entail? It entails identifying androcentric bias in science, but what do we really understand by science? Science as an institution with its specific subculture, as methodology with its ontological and epistemological assumptions. Again, these are very technical terms. I don't want to go into them extensively today, but hopefully we will at some point. And but these assumptions are not only about the study of sex and gender itself, but about the universe at large.
Ma'am, sorry to interrupt. Could you please try the slideshow at the bottom of it, bottom of the screen? Yes. The one next to it. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that what? Yeah.
I think it's coming. Yes.
But now I don't seem to see it.
I can't see it either.
I can't see it either.
Yeah, it's just a dark screen. If you press the forward and backward keys, maybe it's going to come to the next slide and it should be fine.
Is it any better?
Maybe you can try on this slide mode once.
Any better?
I can again see
Can
the
maybe
not yet.
Yes.
Oh, okay, lovely.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay. So, as I said, what is feminist science studies? We were somewhere here. We were talking about intersectionality. We were talking about what does FSS entail. Now, FSS often, as I was just saying, has a very uneasy and difficult relationship between women practitioners of science because of the unease with labels. Am I a feminist? Am I not a feminist? If I call myself a feminist, do I run the risk of getting ghettoized within the academia? What do I do? Yeah. But more importantly, it's because FSS is seen as pushing the envelope much more deeper than at the moment a lot of practitioners, women practitioners in science actually in India would be comfortable doing, which is that we push the question of the nature of science itself, yeah, which is not just the culture of science, but exactly our scientific theory is gendered, is scientific methodology gendered, is scientific knowledge gendered. But I firmly believe that the best dent in any discipline is made from within, and I'm hoping that it will be women practitioners who will eventually tell us exactly what is wrong with science. Yeah. This is one of my very favorite quotations. I don't know whether I will be talking about this, but I thought I'll just read it today. It's by Sandra Harding, written all the way back in 1986. So all versions of the scientific worldview take science to be a totalizing theory. It has been assumed that anything and everything worth understanding can be explained or interpreted within the assumptions of modern science. Yet there is another world hidden from the consciousness of science, the world of emotions, feelings, political values, of the individual and collective unconscious, of social and historical clarity explored by novels, drama, poetry, music, and art, within which we all live most of our waking and dreaming hours, under constant threat of its increasing infusion by scientific rationality. Part of the project of feminism is to reveal the relationship between the two worlds and how each shapes and forms the other. Uh, Now, how did Ephesus begin? I'll quickly run you through that. Evelyn Fox Keller, very well-known feminist biologist, scientist, talks about two things. She says that what we needed was science studies to develop in the academia. This was, of course, as I was telling you earlier, propelled by social movements like the pacifist movement, which questioned the role of science in wars, the environmental movement in terms of what is this kind of science that we are sort of producing, which is sort of creating havoc with the environment, and the women's movement, which was basically talking about how science constructs women and their bodies. And of course, then the methodological debates that happened around what we call positivism, which is basically trying to say that science and scientific knowledge and scientific rationality should and must be the basis of all knowledge. Yeah. So when we started questioning that, a field called science studies developed, and that was necessary for FSS to develop. The next important thing she says is that in feminist theory itself had to mature, right? Because in the early feminist theories, we used gender as a lens to see how individual people become men and women. That means, how do I become man? How do I become woman? How do I become somebody who doesn't fit into either of these? Yeah. That was one of our early questions. And second question is to examine the relationship of power between men and women, right? To say that how how is the difference constructed in the basis of, therefore, I mean, if I'm man, why do I have more power? And that was the whole question of patriarchy. It was later in, say, perhaps the late 70s and early 80s that we began using gender as a lens to critically examine imaginative and cognitive domains, and to argue that these are also deeply gendered, silently and symbolically, where gender might be hidden, but it's present. So that's when we start asking the question, is scientific knowledge, or is science, which is otherwise considered to be neutral and not value imbued, is it really carrying bias within itself? In India, I add that the critique of colonial national modernity had to develop, its paradigm of development and progress had to be questioned before we could venture and begin questioning and challenging and critiquing science. Yeah. So that's how it all began. Now, I would outline 4 registers of feminist science studies. One is, how do we explain the low participation of women in science? What we try to do is basically counter the argument of biological ability of men and women, which is still something we all face, that women are biologically not capable of, mathematics or this or that, despite empirical evidence indicating otherwise. The other model of explaining a low participation of women in science is society, which, society is responsible, the dual role of women, their role as mothers and home builders, etc., etc. But this is also empirically unsound, because we see that a lot of women who do not participate in these so-called feminine roles also find discrimination in science. Classic case being Barbara McClintock. Yeah, so we move it to basically saying that we try to move that paradigm and model to asking the question whether there is something in science itself which we need to look at to answer the question of low participation of women. The second register that we look at is uncovering the androcentric bias in scientific research design, which reproduce and legitimize stereotypical and common sense notions of sex and gender. The third thing that we try to look at, again, this might seem a bit technical for today's session, but I thought I'll just flag it off. That is theorizing the gendered ontological assumptions above the subject matter of science itself, that is nature, and then reimagining the relationship between people and natures. For example, why is nature considered to be feminine? Why do we use the language of obeying laws of nature? Okay, things like that, and much deeper, of course. And of course, the last register, fourth register that we look at is critiquing masculine epistemologies that are based on abstract knowledges rather than on embodiment, separation of the knower and known, to gain objective and neutrality and university. We argue for a more connected epistemology, where we say that the knower and known is far more connected than separated, and objectivity is gained out of that connection rather than with the separation. Now, having said this, today I'm not going to really deal with all of that. I'm just going to focus on A, which is to look at the women question in science from a feminist perspective rather than the feminist question in science. Yeah, though I do hope that in this coming decade we will be able to speak of that in Indian science, because why I say this is because in the early 80s and 90s, when I got into this field, even women in science were largely saying science is based on merit. So any discrimination that we feel or experience has nothing to do with the culture of science. That has changed dramatically today. Yeah, today's women in science definitely recognize that the bias comes from within science. Yeah, so I've set out 4 contours for this conversation today on the low participation of women in science, our FSS methodology to the question, problematizing the idea. You can see I've done this in a rush and there's lots of typos. Problematizing the idea and literature of the role model that we have, debating mentoring practices, and lastly, the idea of genius. So, Rupkatha, you have to tell me if I am running, crossing over time, yeah? So,
yes, ma'am, I'll tell you.
Yeah, we begin with asking, why do we see so few women participating in science? Yeah, what leads to these so-called terms like glass ceiling? What is the leaky pipeline? Why do we see more women in disciplines like biology and not in physics? So as I was saying earlier, in order to answer these questions, we shift the focus from a biological or even social explanation. We put the spotlight on science. We start asking the questions like other institutions, is science also patriarchal in its discourse and practice? So when we examine controversy generated by comments made by people like Larry Summer and Tim Hunt, I think all of you might know about it, so I'm not going to repeat those, or even what Raman did to Kamala Soni. How do we explain these? Yeah, were they bad human beings, these men? Or are they bad human beings? Or are they determined by a structure and culture, not only outside of science, which is the social world that they live in, but a structure and culture of and in science itself? Yeah, if yes, then what is this culture? So you can see that we are shifting methodologically in FSS. We are shifting the explanatory model to try and ask that what is wrong with science. Yeah. In order to be true to our intersectional understandings of the world, we also simultaneously ask the question of why do we see so few persons from other marginal locations like race, ethnicity, caste, and sexuality. Again, I'm sort of mistyping some of that. So basically how this gets operationalized is we will ask the question, okay, if there are a large number of women entering science in some areas, you can see that statistically, we still need to ask the question, which women? Yeah. So which women? Are they women from a privileged caste community? is a question that we never sort of ask. So while it is important, and I would say, to generate quantitative data, and some of the women in science are doing wonderfully with the kind of data that they are producing on the low representation of women and other marginal people in science, this helps a lot, for example, in improving policy. Yeah, the policy people understand only the language of numbers. Yeah. It is important for us, for example, in the social sciences, to offer what we can from qualitative research and how women experience discrimination, bias, or simply being othered. We have narratives globally from Evelyn Fox Keller, Banu Subramaniam, who combines gender and post-colonial identity, Evelyn Hammonds, who combines race and gender, and Ben Barres, of course, everyone in biology knows about what happened when he moved from being female to male and the kind of experiences that he speaks about. Yeah? In my own pilot study, it was done a long time ago, of collecting individual and intimate narratives of women in maths, physics, biology, come handy when we speak of women's relationships to their science and how cultures around science perceive them. So, for example, one of the things that came up was, as young women in science, young girls who show exceptional and prodigious talent, whether in maths, largely in maths actually, were stigmatized by their peers, by their school teachers, to say that, oh, you're not really behaving like a woman, and the kind of fear that it produces in that young child to say, oh my God, if I'm prodigious with numbers, does that mean I'm not a girl? So these kind of complex narratives come out. In India, that is Asha, Achyutan, and I recently generated 3 sets of paired narratives. Again, methodologically, this might be interesting to some of you, and of women and gender non-conforming persons in fundamental science, again, maths, theoretical physics, and molecular biology. The pair had a successful, quote unquote, woman in science, and one who had moved in science. Okay, each talking about their experiences from the Indian context. We had Prajwal Shastri, who spoke about she was not a part of the paired narratives, but her essay is a very good one in our Feminists in Science volumes. Sumati and Chainika wrote on physics. Sujata Ramadurai, Jayashree Subramaniam, and Geeta Venkatraman, who I haven't mentioned here somehow, were doing the maths narratives. Bittu K, Vidita Vaidya, Shalini Madhav, and Marantha Walang were doing essays on biology. And it was very interesting because what came through is what I'll come to in a minute through these. But methodologically, I want you to understand that what we were trying to say is that numbers are important, but we have to go beyond and into the numbers to get a texture of discrimination or of bias or of othering that women experience. Numbers often tend to not show that. Yeah. So now our aim was to go beyond in these narratives. We were trying to also go beyond the role model literature that was being produced both by the scientific community and the state, in which women in science were writing success stories of struggle, of making it big in science or simply to survive in science. A classic example is a very good volume by Ram Ramaswamy and Rohini Godbole called Lilavati's Daughters, which produce very nice, interesting narratives. Yeah. But I find that this kind of literature typically glosses over the discrimination bias against women by setting up women as a heroine. Even the state wants these kind of role models, how I overcame everything, mostly supported by a very supporting family, etc., etc. So we sought to take a peek into the deeper structures of experience. We asked women to speak openly of discrimination and its effects on themselves and their work. We also asked them to speak of privilege. Now, this is something I wanted to share with you, that largely the women, except Shalini, most of the women came from an upper caste background. So we were asking to see if they could negotiate that if they come with gender, as a category which discriminates, which marginalizes them, there are other axes of caste that they come with which actually privilege them. But I found that it was very difficult to get, we still don't know how to talk about privilege. Let me just put it like that, yeah. So we found that all the women spoke of a diminishing self-worth, despite the fact that largely they came from a caste background. Yeah. The domination of a boys' club in science, the burden of being doubly good, Dalit women from the Northeast, trans persons spoke of multiple levels of bias that often result in them leaving the pursuit of science. Yeah.
Ma'am, gradually wrap up?
Yes.
You just said
Okay.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I do have a lot to say, but what I'm going to do is quickly basically tell you that the mentoring practices, there's a huge debate going on about, do we prepare the girls and women into coming into science and facing, becoming confident, becoming hard, losing, do we need to give them professional networks and build cultures of support and care, particularly in instances of sexual harassment and violence, but also how to perform femininity and how not to perform, how not to come off as being weak and feminine, etc., etc. But I'd argue saying that we need to look at mentoring practices more deeply, more carefully, to say how do we develop collective and cooperative cultures. I'll end with this. I think that the low participation of women in science is also to do with this whole idea of genius. Interestingly, the idea of genius is something which I would submit comes in the way of a wholehearted and full participation of women in science. In pre-modern epochs, you saw genius was a guiding spirit of a person, of a family, place that helped them in birthing, begetting new ideas. Over modernity, 18th century, it became an attribute of an individual based upon innate talent. A lot of feminist work will tell you that it is simultaneously at this time that gender ideologies also got constructed. Yeah. So historically, the genius became the individual, male, masculine, endowed with innate talent, which is something which I hope biologists will contest and have been contesting, gifted, committed to the pursuit of knowledge above everything else. This idea completely comes in the way of women's participation. And I strongly believe that we need to change this idea towards a more collective and a more work-based idea. And all reward mechanism in science just basically is about rewarding individuals. So I think that comes in the way. Okay, so now these are the 4 registers that I had put out earlier. We've spoken only about the first. Sometime in life, we shall speak about the others. By way of conclusion, it is difficult to develop the field of feminist science studies, I think, because there's a very high premium on science in modern times. Every time we say that we are, doing a science critique, we are, accused of being anti-development. So it's very important to get the balance right. I would say FSS should not fall into the polemics of a pro-science and anti-science discourse. Very often this happens, and we have to be extremely careful about that. We also need to be steering clear of the kind of critiques that are coming from right-wing quarters, simply because this is an academic pursuit of science criticism. It comes out of feminist values of inclusiveness, care, and justice, and not out of the identity politics of dominant groups. And most importantly, I'd like to conclude by saying that the hegemony of science in our academia must be challenged through every discipline, particularly through the scientific disciplines themselves. And how, for example, as a sociologist, have some of us challenged the hegemony of science within sociology to try and argue saying that we need to look at sociology differently. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm sorry I took a little more time than I should have. I'm really sorry. Thank you.
Hopefully, we'll come back to those themes when we get questions.
I
Yes. So I would now request Nandita, who's a practitioner of feminist science in a way. She is a co-founder of a feminist science media platform. So I would love to request her to talk about her experiences, her journey, and why she started it. And I think some of us know about the life of science. I hope through this platform, more people come to know about your work. Please go ahead, Nandita.
Thanks, Rupkata. And frankly, I could just listen this whole 2 hours of at least 1 hour of Geeta talking.
Yeah.
And because I learn so much every time I listen to her, because so Rupkata, I would not call myself a feminist, science studies, because I have never studied sociology in my life. I did not even know the meaning. So why I'm saying this is because there is a very clear distinction between what Geeta is doing and what I do. When Ashima and I started the Life of Science, it was really just meant to be a science communication initiative. We just wanted to write about what kinds of science is being done in our backyard, and it just happened that we decided to focus on women because we thought that we don't hear about women scientists enough. So it started off like this, and I think a few, like maybe even a dozen interviews into our the beginning of the project, we realized that there were these common threads, these patterns that people were repeating, and we, when we started, we were really not doing this, going looking for these role models, what Geeta said. So we thought that there is value in going to, like often we would go completely randomly, especially Ashima would just walk into institutes and look if there are, any women scientists there, and finally find somebody and talk to them, because we wanted to steer clear of this place of judgment where we decide whether this person's story is good enough to be told. And it worked out because everybody is doing some sort of work based on in some field of science which was really interesting, and whatever the field of science, whatever their level of seniority, we saw that lot of these experiences were common. So that's when we really thought that, okay, maybe we have to, own up to this responsibility of, if we are focusing on women scientists, then we cannot, it's futile to try and stay objective or to try and stay science centric or all those things. So we really started embracing this other side of this identity side of these women's journeys, and it became, a lot. Sometimes, depending on the interview, we would focus most of the article on their journey and on their the non-hardcore science part of it. And often there would be women who are not very comfortable talking about this. So in that case, this articles would be more science centric. So that's how it started. And I think it was only maybe about 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago when we actually started engaging, and we started, reading more in depth into the work of people like Geeta, who have been studying feminist science for studies for a long time. And we really understood that there is this field and there are these people who are qualified and trained to look at science in this way. And that really helped us in asking what kind of questions to ask, and in terms of also sensitivity, in like sometimes as journalists and as people who have been bred on this concept of like the powerful woman who is empowered to make bold decisions, it was often frustrating when we saw that the scientists are not the way that we wanted them to be. They're not they're not in this very conventional way strong. Sometimes they would be very afraid of talking about a lot of topics, or once an article was published, they would get back to us saying that they want it pulled down because it would get them in trouble with their colleagues, and there's always a sense of defensive nature that would come in us, which is very annoyed that we put all this work into it, and why doesn't she see that she's not said anything wrong? Why can't she stand up to her colleagues? But really, the more we read about the kind of atmosphere that the kind of scientific environment that most of our scientists work in, it became clear that it's really not anybody's fault, and not everybody has the privilege, the kind of support, the kind of network to afford to rebel. And unfortunately, something that one of our early interviewees told us herself is that in science in India, there are only two people who can succeed. One are people who have tremendous amounts of support, and the other type is people who rebel. So if you don't belong to one of these categories, if you don't have tremendous amounts of support, but you're just not the kind, not everybody is born innately rebellious, or not everybody has the same sort of personality and the same strengths and the same weaknesses. But if you happen to be somebody who who does not want the limelight, or who just wants to silently do your work, then it's not enough if you're brilliant at science. You have to have tremendous amounts of support. So so these kinds of things really we were able to understand thanks to a lot of work that has already been done. And unfortunately, we feel that it's not enough well known yet. None of our students of science engage in science studies in any way, which is really unfortunate, because I mean, you have to, like Geeta said, you have to, if you are studying something, you have to be able to ask these extremely difficult questions, and to question and to critique what you're studying. It's not just about, I'm a scientist, so I will never question science. If you're a scientist and you love science, then that makes it all the more reason why you have to question it, why you have to have bigger expectations of this thing that you you've dedicated your life to.
On that note, Nandita, if I may just cut in, sorry to interrupt you. So, if I can direct this question towards the queer and the transgender persons of science who are almost invisible, and this is a group that we do not talk about, and even as a platform, I think, biologically speaking, as a platform, we want to say that we want to talk about it, and we do not want to look the other way, and we do not want to define the conservative idea of womanhood, and we are ready to talk about gender bias, not just for women, but queer, transgender people in science. And I would like you to talk about the season 5 effort of yours, which is showcasing them, and is probably going to start a big conversation.
Yeah. So again, over the past 2.5 years, we've also, Ashima and me, who identify both as cis women, even though we knew that this is happening, this how our conversations about women in science were so completely limited to the gender binary. And so we would often but we thought that I think we thought that, okay, but we have to overcome this hurdle before before the world is prepared to look at this more nuancedly. And we sort of, I guess, unwittingly were seeking refuge in the fact that people were not ready to have, or we thought people were not ready to have these conversations. But the hypocrisy of that really hit us, I think, during a physics conference, which Geeta was also there for in 2018, called Pressing for Progress, where there were of course a minority, but there was a presence of some young scientists who were non-binary and transgender scientists. And I overheard a conversation actually during lunch where a few of them were talking to some of the sociologists present and saying that, in a lot of these talks, where we talk about women in science, what we do is we add this disclaimer in the beginning saying we know that gender is not binary, and but unfortunately we are not capable of it. We don't have the bandwidth to address this, so we are sticking to this binary. So a lot of people were doing that disclaimer and then going on to talk to talk in a exclusionary way, which completely disregards the existence of transgender and non-binary people in science. So actually, I don't know. I definitely heard this, and it really sort of irked us. And we thought that, okay, we are not doing this right job. And I guess serendipitously, what happened was the next that was our season 4 just got over, and we were looking for a new coordinator for our season 5. And one of the applicants was Shayantan Datta. So Shayantan is a person, they do not identify with the binary. They are a non-binary neuroscientist who is also written quite a bit about a lot of feminist science studies issues in some magazines. So we had read it and we were familiar with their work, but their joining, the Life of Science really gave us this, it really made us brave enough to think that, okay, we can do this, we can address this issue, and we don't have to address it. What we have to do is just find people to do this for us. We don't have to speak for anybody. We don't have to speak for the marginalized. There are plenty of amazing people within these groups who are happy to speak. So we sort of went into this role of editorial, and we really started like we tried to hang the mic to others as much as possible. And Shantan led this mini series on transgender scientists in science. And I mean, unfortunately, there are still very, very, very few of them. But if we expand on what we see as science, we can actually start finding, more of them. If we only look at the principal investigators and research institutes, we are not going to find anybody, or we're going to find the same one or two people. But if we look at, even people who studied science and who had to drop out, or who had to go into other areas. So, for example, Grace Banu is one of the people we featured in the series, and Grace is a trans woman who is an engineer. So she's an engineer, but she became an activist, but not because, I don't think anybody wants to become an activist, right? You become an activist because there is some sort of an injustice which you want to fight. And Grace is an activist today, but also works as a technologist. So we did include Grace also in the series, and Ashoka University's Bittu is also there. And also we did a lot of other interviews with people, and there was a general reportage also that Shantan did on transgender people in science. So I would highly recommend. I can maybe link it in the chats if people want to read about it more. But I think there's a lot to be gained if we just pass on the mic and stop judging people based on what we think makes a good speaker for a panel, or what we think makes somebody a good scientist. If we break away from these notions, then we see that there are people who we can listen to, and we should do that more.
Thanks, Nandita. That was wonderful, and congratulations on season 5. And I hope more and more people check it out. More and more people come to realize what you just said, that passing the mic is the most important thing. On that note, when she says stop judging people, I would now request Dr. Saran to please go ahead. Ma'am, you're
okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you, and thank you for including me in this discussion. I don't have anywhere, any slideshow or anything. I was thinking of this more as a conversation. And well, I just have my own experience to go by as a mathematician, as a professional, just as a woman in the world of work. It doesn't actually just have to be science. And as a parent as well, I have 2 daughters and a son. And my son is in the middle. So I've started to say this because people just assume that my youngest is a boy. I was not trying to have a boy. I already had a boy. I just wanted 3 kids. So yeah. So in the spirit of treating this as a conversation, I want to respond to some of the things that Geeta and Nandita have said. So Geeta, you spoke about science as an all-encompassing, and the idea that science is an all-encompassing and complete way to, I guess, learn about the world, to like get knowledge about the world. And Nandita, you spoke about, whether the question of whether scientists can in fact question science. And I kind of feel that, even before we get into the realm that might exist outside of science, just within the norms of science and the accepted idea, scientific idea that, we, for example, need data to support our conjectures. Just within these norms. I mean, science may or may not be all encompassing and complete, but it's what we've got, and it's pretty good at many things. So just within those scientific parameters, there's so much that we know that we somehow aren't able to bring to bear in our practices, our professional practices in universities and in evaluations, in hiring practices. There's a lot we know. Well, I know that the panelists will all know this work, so I hesitate a little bit, but there are 50 people here and maybe more watching this on YouTube, so maybe it's worth saying. There is this idea of implicit bias that we know a lot about. And about 25 years ago, Anthony Greenwald developed this test to sort of measure implicit bias. And his original test was, pretty like neutral in terms of like a social experiment. It was just an association where there were 4 topics: insects, flowers, and pleasant and unpleasant words. And it turned out that it was much easier to associate insects with unpleasant words and flowers with pleasant words. And then this experimental design, I want to share my screen. I want to show you it's been, there are lots of associations that you can check, that you can use to check implicit bias. So this website is called projectimplicit.net. And here you see, are you seeing my screen? Is it visible? And then you can actually take a test. So here's the take a test.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And then there are lots of tests. Now there's one, well, there are lots. And there's they address issues of weight, race is a big thing, at least in the US, and skin tone, sexuality. And here's one on gender and science. So the association, the bias that it seeks to reveal is, one is biased towards associating men with science and women with the liberal arts. And these biases famously exist even in people who are sure that they don't have them, and they operate in men and women as well. So there are some easy ways to counter bias. For example, if you're grading, you can grade blindly. And if you don't know which ones, bias operates in many ways. It's not just gender. I mean, I see it in myself. If there's a student who I know is generally a good student, and shows up and is earnest and generally does okay, I'm inclined to make allowances for them when I'm grading their paper. And if there's somebody who generally is like never shows up, or I hardly know them, or I know them and I know that basically they blow off everything, then I'm inclined to be a little harsher. I notice this in myself. And this is easily fixed by setting up grading where you don't know who it is. And especially if it's a large class, or it's a class where your submissions are typed. So if there are 10 students and I'm meeting them every day and they're submitting papers, I know their handwritings. So it's difficult to hide their identities. Well, I guess it's a classroom version of like blind review. But even when it's easy to do, people don't do it. There are good reasons to do it. And, even somebody like Larry Summers, and Geeta mentioned Larry Summers. In 2005, he made his famous, remarks. And I've written it down, the words he used as a theory to explain the underrepresentation of women in top positions in science was, these are his words, quote, issues of intrinsic aptitude, unquote. So this was in 2005, and I was in Cambridge at the time. My partner was doing a PhD at Harvard, and I benefited from his remarks, because that was the year I had my first daughter. She's 16 now. And because of the uproar that resulted from these remarks, Harvard actually changed some of its policies. And one of the things it put in place was subsidized childcare for graduate students with children. So that's how I ended up benefiting. But, there are so many practices that are not actually driven by any data. And there's this, I face this. At Ashoka, for example, we have, this idea of a liberal education, and it is part of what we do, part of what makes us unique as a university, that students are not shunted into a major as soon as they join. And we don't want them to be. Like, even if a student is ready and they come in and they are ready to start their major and they're sure they want to do it, such a student probably wants to do economics. This is just the reality. They're sure they want to do economics. Then we want to say, no, don't start. We don't even, you may be sure, but just hold your horses, and you're not going to pick your major now. You have to do all these courses and all these different things. There's your broad education. We want breadth as well as depth. And a lot of people change their minds. I've seen it happen, especially in the early batches, which were small. So most of us knew most of the students individually in the whole batch. We saw it happen, a lot. And we were happy because this is supposed to happen. Like, if you at 18 decide what you want to do and never change your mind, then something is maybe wrong. So this is sort of what we want. But somehow, when it comes to mathematics, there is this idea that you shouldn't have a break in your study of mathematics. I'm not sure where this idea comes from, but it's pretty ingrained, at least among many, of my senior colleagues, for example. You shouldn't have a break in the study of mathematics. Now, in Israel, there is a 3-year draft. So young people go off to the army. They don't study any math. Maybe some of them do, I don't know, but by and large, they don't. And for 3 years, they are not doing math. They're not studying anything. They're in the army. And then they come back, and then they go to university, and then they study math. So after this very long break, well, not all of them study math, but they do. And as I don't know, like per capita, again, I don't know the data. This is I don't know the exact numbers, but if you look at the, established mathematicians, the winners of prizes, Israel has a disproportionate representation of, world-class mathematicians who did have a break in their study, and a pretty long one too. So it would be nice if even like within the accepted understanding of what is, a scientific data-driven justification for a practice, if we actually did just that. We don't seem to be doing that. And I don't know, it's just, it's frustrating because, you're supposed to be scientists. So like, how about we justify our practices and our opinions with some kind of, scientific or data-driven, I don't know, justification. And another thing that Geeta, you said was that people in policy speak the language of numbers. I kind of wish they didn't speak the language of numbers, because I don't think they do. They seem to often just speak the language of like accepted opinion. And, this is, I mean, one has to be curious first and figure out what are the numbers and what does the data say? And if it doesn't exist, how can we collect it? And it's hard. I mean, it's not going to happen if you don't care about the question in the first place, So, well, why aren't there more women faculty? Well, okay, they're not applying. Well, why are they applying? Maybe there's something to be curious about here, Why are they self-selecting out? I don't know. So you would never accept a theorem without proof, but somehow, I don't know. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, if you just wrap up.
Okay, all right. Okay, and finally, I just want to say one more thing. This also a response to something that actually both the previous speakers have said, like this question of privilege. Having been a student here in India and in the US, there's an interesting thing that happens that I experienced, just my personal experience, and I definitely had a lot of privilege, and I had a mother who just believed that like I was the smartest thing on the planet. And she said to me when I was throughout for many years, she said, you should be a brain surgeon, because that was the most difficult thing she could think of that I should do. So we don't know that much about the brain. So brain surgery is actually pretty basic, but anyway, she didn't know that. So yeah, and I then had my children in the US, all of them, and I saw my eldest was going to school there, and I think that this, if you are in a position of privilege and come from a supportive family, and your own parents at least don't think that girls shouldn't do science, then actually it's easier. There's less stereotyping in India. There was an if at the beginning of this, because we don't have this like pink and blue business. I didn't grow up with Disney princesses, and I didn't grow up with like a lot of this stuff that I see creates this association of, I don't know, girls and certain types of toys and all of this. I mean, in some ways, I think I was better off here in India, and I didn't have such a strong genderization that pulled me away from science. It was just normal for me to do. So, okay, I'll stop there. Thank you. Those were just some comments. I guess the summary is, I wish we would apply science to science.
So when it comes to biases, I was just thinking the other day that when I hear the word mathematician, I cannot think of a woman. Now that I've talked to you, I can think of a woman.
Yeah,
so
no, but I have
the
to
visibility.
say, so I read an interview with the same guy, Anthony Greenwald, and he talks about what are the practices that can de-bias a person. And unfortunately, he says there aren't any that we know of, and we've been working on this for 20 years. So exposure to a counterexample, right? Exposure to a figure that goes against the stereotype, such as a female mathematician or a Black authority figure or whatever, it has an immediate debiasing effect, immediate. Like you do one of these bias detecting tests, then you have this exposure, you do it again, there's a change. It's immediate, but it only lasts for half an hour.
Okay.
Yes, the next day the effect is gone, because that's like one exposure versus a lifetime of conditioning. So de-biasing is, maybe we haven't figured it out, but there's a difference between reducing bias and reducing the effect of bias, which one can still do through practices such as, uh, blind grading is a great example.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So we have to start by like knowing what exactly is happening.
True.
I'll stop.
Debiasing.
Yes.
That's. Thank you, Maya.
Yes.
That was lovely, and debiasing. So Suchita, you are a science communicator. When you communicate science, do communicators face this dilemma of whether to write about the science or about the woman, the person who's doing the science? So how do you decide it? And yeah, please. I mean, that was just a question. And please go ahead.
Thank you, Rupkata, for introducing me and Biologically Speaking and Bioswitch India to have this platform, because this platform is a place where we are talking about this bias and also looking at solutions to see how we can bridge this gap, gender gap, and look at gender equity and gender equality in a different lens, and also initiate conversations, right? So I'd say this is a platform for communicating science, and we're talking about women in science, right? So, and I'm really glad Maya ended on the note of how how we can create solutions or see how we can de-bias this perspective that people have, and also I'm really glad that there were so many points that were brought out from the other panelists that my job has been easier. I just have to connect the dots and like tell people how, as an individual, how you can actually go forward, right? So yes, while communicating science, it's very important to see how you can strike a balance between the science itself and who is conducted the science and who is communicating the science, right? So at Cyto, very recently we actually concluded a workshop where we were talking about different elements of communicating science, and Ashima, the co-founder of the Life of Science of Nandita, she was also there, and we had a very interesting conversation there. And also I was insistent on Ashima talking about how we can have inclusivity while writing or communicating science, right? So there were a lot of things that came up, and here, right, at this point of time, I want to bring up this particular point that while communicating science, why do we have to have that bias, like especially people perceive that communicating science is mostly by writing. There are so many other formats as well. So let's say storytelling is one of the major elements of communicating science, right? So when you're communicating science, why don't you in the form of storytelling, why don't you say have protagonists who are women, right? So, and have the pronouns she or even they to be inclusive of the gender diverse people, right? So these are some things that actually pick the reader's mind and say that, okay, I had this implicit bias that this protagonist, or the person who's conducted this science is a woman, not a man, right? So these are certain things that are really fundamental when you're communicating science, and that you can from the grassroots initiate a thought process, if not conversation, right? With that, I want to actually sort of talk a little bit on a personal note. In fact, Geeta, Maya, and Nandita have had quite some time and experience in academia, and they've had very unique perspectives, about gender equity in Indian academia. And I'm really glad there are different perspectives in the panel that is being discussed, right? So, me as a recent graduate in science, right? So I graduated my master's in 2017. So this, if I must say, compared to the other panelists, I'm just entering academia, right? So a lot of people talk about, gender biases and a lot of other intersectional biases in academia, but where does it start? How does it start? We need to think a little bit about that, right? So when I began, studying science, and also moved on to conduct research. I must say that I was, like, very fortunate to have a very supportive group, from family and from my institutes, right? So like how Nandita says, you either have to have tremendous support or you have to be a rebel, right? So there all the bosses or supervisors that I had were female and women, right? So I, on a personal note, if I have to say, I did not have to go through the bias firsthand, but should I be happy about it? I don't know, because coming to think of it, I can think of it in a positive note or an optimistic note, that there are more women scientists coming up, but at what rate? And also, fine, there are women scientists, but how happy, successful, or satisfied are they? They certainly have a lot of pressure, and also, even however accomplished they are from their male counterparts, how quickly are they being promoted to higher positions, right? So these were certain things that I keep thinking about all the time. And also, a lot of times, I see my fellow female friends who have been, they have been imposed to such biases, right? So it could be, I'm sure a lot of the participants here are just, finishing their masters or even like doing their PhD and all that, right? So I want to sort of address bias at that stage in academia, where, people, there is a lot of pressure in Indian families to actually, get married, and you can pursue your PhD later on, right? So and also, before getting into that, I want to sort of put this forward, that sure, we're optimistic about, or we have sort of progressed, that, before, women or girls were not allowed to study at all. Now we are studying, but how progressive is that? We are transitioning from a regressive society to progressive regressive society, right? So people are very supportive if their daughter is studying, at a certain level, and maybe a few families are happy when they're working. But when it comes to, moving to a different place and, accepting higher positions where you will need more commitment, right? So that time, of course, there is a lot of pressure that is being put on the woman, right? So there are a lot of hard decisions that a woman or a girl has to pick up, right? So a few examples in my circle, right? They're conducting research and they want to apply for a PhD, go abroad, but um, how would you deal with it? Do you apply, go for a PhD and then find your partner there, or find a partner and then find a PhD position over there, right? So not always everything works out for everyone, right? So this is one bias. Apart from that, when you go to the next stage, where uh, let's say both the husband and wife are scientists, right? So there is a particular mandate in India that both the husband and wife cannot have professorship positions in the same institute. But how do you deal with that? And it depends on sheer luck, if if the husband gets a position in the desired institute, or the wife, right? So that is something. And the next level is when, probably you want to take a break to tend to your child, and for maternity leave, right? So again, there's a break, if she want to decide to, like how Maya mentioned, right? So it's I have to tell you, I don't know if it's comforting or discomforting, but even in biology, people say, you're not supposed to have a break, and it will probably ruin your career, right? So these are some questions, hard questions, that women have to actually think about, whereas men don't have to think about it at all, at least most of them, right? So I mean, there could be exceptions, but they don't have to think about it, right? So it just makes life harder for women to make decisions. And it's not just about the science that they like, they want the research that they want to conduct, right? So it's outside of science, or the societal norms that actually are actually making women think about it. So everyone knows that, I don't have the right numbers, but you can. It's very obvious that in your undergrad or postgraduate colleges, you see a lot of girls or female students studying, whereas there are very few. In my bachelor's, I had just one boy in the class. We were 10 girls. So, but later on, when you move on to higher positions, these associate professors, all of them or most of them are male, right? Why is that happening? Why is that inverse shift in the increased number of male counterparts as taking up positions than women, right? What is making them drop their career midway? It could be either after their masters, either after PhD or postdoctoral studies, right? So there are so many other factors than just the science that they would want to pursue, that affect the progress of a woman's career, right? So with that, I would want to transition a little bit and talk about how the field of science communication or communicating science itself can address some problems, some such problems, right?
So just to button Suchita, so this question which is often asked to women scientists, that how do you balance life and career, the personal life, family life, children. So this question is probably not asked as much to men.
Sure.
And
Yes.
when it keeps coming up in interviews, does it add to the stereotype? And what is the way out? Is asking the questions the right thing or not asking the questions the right thing as a communicator? Maybe your perspective on it.
I probably want Maya to answer this. Have you been asked this question? How did you feel?
Yeah, I guess Maya would be great.
How did you feel when
Okay.
you asked that question?
Well, look, my children's father is also, an academic. And it would, like, if you travel, for example, especially when my kids were smaller, or if I go out somewhere, like just, by myself, then people ask, well, who's looking after your children? Like, what are you going to do with your children? Like, this is like a puzzle, but nobody's asking him. And I would say they're with the man they call Papa. So, yeah, it gets asked. It shouldn't be asked. It never gets asked to men. Never. I'll just say it. Nobody ever in the history of the world has asked a man, who's looking after your children?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, this particular bias, I mean, there's no argument at all. It is based on historical bias and the cultural or social norms the so-called social norms that we have, right? Say it's okay for you to at least from the circle that I am around, right? So it's okay for you to pick a career, whatever you want to do, like for a woman. Okay, that's good, but how much farther do you want to progress in your career, and how much support do you have? No one has an answer, and this sort of progressive regressive society is very dangerous. At least when personally, if you ask me at a comparison of just being regressive or progressive regressive, which one do you choose? At least in a regressive society, you knew that this was the hard line, but here you just
It's
don't.
bait and switch.
Yeah, I know. I mean, just like for convenience, you just say yes, certainly, girls, their daughters should study, they should be learned and all of that. But is that just like one of the check boxes that needs to be ticked when you're getting her married off, or is it actually telling her that you go pursue your career, do whatever you want, achieve whatever you want to do, right? So, I mean, this is something that everyone needs to think about, right? With that, I actually want to, shift the discussion a little bit towards how we can address this, right? And how science communication as a career can, be looked at. It's up for argument, but this is how I see it, and with respect to the discussion we have right now, right? So, science communication is a field of science where you can, at least for me that I've seen, you can literally work from anywhere. That you don't have the liberty in science research. right? So, and also I'd say that that way it empowers women. I mean, I don't know if that's a good thing to say or a bad thing, but when you have a lot of these questions that you're looking at, you have a break in between, your research career. Why don't you keep in touch while, you write about your research, you study a lot about it, do some lot of data analysis and things like that, right? So I'd say, I mean, why don't you look at this as an opportunity to see how you can keep yourself in touch with the sciences, right? So this is absolutely my perspective. It's up for debate. And also, I'd say that this is a passageway to brainstorming solutions to this problem, right? So this particular discussion that we are having, a lot of people are being inducted to a lot of fundamentals, especially like, with the sociological perspective that, Geeta brought about, with the personal experience that Maya has brought about, and Nandita as a person, as a journalist, when she wanted to understand the journeys of women, right? So I say that science communication is a passageway to it. And also, I want to point out a two-pronged approach for this, where the first thing is the practical aspects of science communication. Like I said, you can communicate science from the comfort of your home, right? You don't have to detach yourself from science when you're not conducting research. That's one thing. On the other hand, the outcomes of science communication, right? So you can talk to people, educate them, right? Of course, there will be a lot of biases, not just within yourself, but the with whom you're having the conversation with, right? So you need to understand from what background they're coming from and what is the kind of bias they have inherently. Identify it, voice that out, ask them why do you feel that this is a particular bias. Mostly people just don't know why they're biased, right? So we just spoke, right? Men don't get asked why how, who's taking care of your children, but do you ask, if when you ask someone why you don't ask men, they don't usually have an answer, right? So it's only about bringing about that awareness and telling people that, see, I don't, you're probably not a bad person, but you have this implicit bias which you need to actually realize,
Yes, right.
and you need to be aware of, right? So that's one thing. And also
Right.
presenting scenarios, like, also
So,
talking more about.
Suchita,
Sure.
sorry to interrupt, but yeah, you should just wrap up, then we'll just
Yes,
move
yes,
on to the questions.
I'll ask a couple of
Yeah,
points.
yeah, I think, yeah.
Also talking presenting scenarios and building stories. So presenting scenarios in the sense that we have a very good example, the life of science here, where we're talking only about the science conducted by women, right? To have more conversations, talk about women who have achieved great heights, and also even women who are conducting research and just transcending all the barriers that they have, right? So that's one thing. And initially I mentioned about how storytelling can be a powerful tool, right? So when you're building a story, talking about it could be a fictional or a modification of the real life story that you want to present, and have characters, right? So you have female protagonists, and also encourage or support more of your female friends or your colleagues to come up, talk about it. And also I want to point out that it's very important to have, like, what Geeta mentioned, that it's very important to train women's apart from scientific research, but also to how you're going to tackle such situations, and how you're going to come out strong and transcend all of these barriers, right? So yes, that's all I have.
Thank you, Suchita. Thank you so much. So we have a few questions on the chat. We also have a few questions from ourselves. Question to Geeta, but it's also to the others. The genius culture in science that you talk about, it's masculine and it's associated with privilege. So does it also what is this construct of a genius? Can you hear me?
Your voice was breaking, Rupkatha.
Yes. So could you hear the question?
I could hear.
Yeah, maybe you should just repeat the
Can,
question.
yes. So the genius culture that you talk about, does it add to the imposter syndrome that women and non-binary people in science or people from marginalized groups who are doing science, trying to do science, they face this idea of a genius and the associated privilege? So how
Yeah.
does it affect the imposter syndrome?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think these are related phenomenon. So, the whole idea of the genius as being somebody, everybody who is inculcated into science or initiated into science, some of our interviews show that they sort of, deify the male genius, whether it's an Einstein or a Feynman or a Galileo or a Newton, or later also, or even in their own communities and circles, there'll be these folk narratives, mythology built around that. Who is a genius? Who is exceptional? How do you define the genius? And because this idea of the genius is so embedded in the individual, and because it is so embedded in the narrative of talent, and that talent is innate and prodigious, therefore it excludes various people. It's not just women, it's not just the gender non-conforming, but it will also exclude some men. Yeah. So in that sense, it is a problematic idea in itself, yeah, and needs to be carefully re-examined. It is not to say that it takes away from creativity in science or even excellence. It's a question of how you construct this, yeah. And it is not, I would argue, and as sociologists, we would like to suggest that it is a socially constructed idea, and we need to deconstruct it, and we need to move towards, more inclusive ideas of creativity, yeah, and in science. So yeah, absolutely. But on the other hand, I must say that it is also strangely, the idea of the genius is also strangely associated with that person who breaks social norm, that person who is a social, a political, and all of that. Yeah. So this genius idea gives a little bit of a clean check to men to do anything. Yeah, because they are not supposed to conform with the social structures around them, of social moral structures to that extent. Yeah.
Right.
You
Yeah.
have people like Alan
So
Turing and others who are, also glorified
yes.
because of their, so there's that also. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. There are other.
So, a related question, and it's to, yes, there are questions in the chat. We'll also come to them. So, this question is almost to all of you, also Nandita, also that you cover people in science more than the science. You cover people in science, and maybe is that approach needed in school and college curriculums, do you think? Because the way we teach science in school and colleges, it's more about the science and not the people who did it. So do you think that approach in undergraduate and master's courses would lead to some kind of a change in attitude? What do you think?
I mean, for sure, it would make science a lot more interesting to a lot of different kinds of learners, and a lot of, there's a lot of perception about what kind of person is good at science, what kind of person should go into science. If we make science more, link it with humanities a little more, I feel that it will be a lot more interesting. That is, of course, maybe a more superficial reason to do this, but besides that, it is also really important, I feel, because like a lot of what Geeta said alluded to, the science that is being done, the research, the findings that are being made are also a product of the people who are doing the science. I mean, any sort of any field that you take, the evolution of our understanding of, whether it's physics or whether it's evolutionary biology, it was really colored by the kind of people who were doing the science and where these findings were coming from. And I mean, I understood this a lot when I read Angela Saini's book Inferior, where she talks about many fields of science which were, especially I think a lot in primatology, for example, where so the scientists were predominantly male at one point, so they would observe these, I cannot remember what species they were, but some species of primates, and using their notions of what females are supposed to be like, what males are supposed to be like, they were reading the behavior in one certain way, which was the wrong way. And when more women started getting into the field, we started seeing that things like that we take for granted, like polygamy, or that women are the more passive players in the whole sexual game is completely untrue for so many species. So so basically what I'm trying to say is that who did the science has has more than we think to do with the kind of science that is coming out of it. So I think it would be, we should, for example, when we're talking about Raman effect and teaching Raman effect, I think that it's our responsibility to also tell these children that Raman was a misogynist, and because of Raman, he probably killed many dreams and probably many more,
and we did not learn that in school or college. I mean, we learned that so much later. And
yes, we learned that. I think I think a lot out of the work of also sociologists who were publishing. Thanks to that, we learned about the side of Raman, and there are still many people who feel that it's irrelevant, that he should only be known for the scientist that he is. But that, let the kids who are learning decide for themselves. We should at least put this information in front of them.
So Vani, who is part of the Biospeak team, she has a comment and a question that even in the field of science, at a university or at an institute level, what she has observed is women are mostly expected to be an equivalent of a homemaker, housemaker. She wants to know whether this observation and this feeling of hers makes any sense. Vani is an important part of our communications team, and any of you, whoever.
No, I want to say something. It's absolutely true in the sense that the pastoral care of students, the social functions of a department are all expected. They default to the women. They just do. And also it's hard to turn away a student, right? And students are selecting you and coming to your office and sitting in front of you because you are more approachable. Either you are more approachable or you're seen as more approachable. And that's part of the talking to students. And we do welcome them. And we do want to hear about, their experiences. And so we listen. And then as a result, we are doing all the listening. It happens. And even, certain organizational tasks or, like I said, the social functions. Yeah, they default to women to a much.
Akshara, please. Akshara Kulkarni is asking that we tend to look at gender representation as a metric, like the number of women in science. But does that really have an effect on the bias? Because the ideas and the stereotypes seem to persist even when there are more women. So how does one go about sort of changing that, I guess? And Dr. Chatta?
I mean, there are a couple of questions. Akshara, to your question, if I may say that you're absolutely right. See, I really don't know whether it's a question of numbers, whether getting more women in will change the bias. Okay, I personally don't think so, because it's the culture of science that you need to change. Yeah, because very often the women who enter it also adopt the same culture, and that kind of mentoring practices that they do, or the kind of cultures that they uphold, also imitate the masculinist paradigms very often. So we have to be very careful. So it's more a critical conscious that needs to be developed. So you're absolutely right. But the numbers have to increase, because a critical mass of any marginalized group in a dominant space is important. Yeah. So I'm not going to say, oh, just because they don't tend to make a difference, we don't need more numbers. Yeah. We don't need more numbers of women. But if you allow me to, Rupkata, there was a very important question right in the
Yeah.
beginning.
Okay. Okay. Can you find it? Because I think the chat
Yes,
went up.
yes, yeah,
And
yeah.
yes.
That's a question that I've been waiting to answer, which was a
Yes,
question
ma'am. Please go ahead.
by
Because the chat sometimes it's so
yeah,
fast that it's yeah.
yeah, it's a question by Anushka, which I think is an important one. So I thought
Yes, ma'am. Please.
there's another question by Vidita, which I'd like to also address.
Yes, ma'am. We'll come.
Yeah. So what Anushka says is, my question is that from what I know, Dr. Kamla Soni was only admitted to ISC on probation for the first year. And one of the conditions for her staying on would be that she should dress, behave in a way that should not be a distraction to her male colleagues. And this is well known. Okay. Raman said it. Do you feel that since then, generations of women have had to inculcate in them the idea that as women scientists, they must let go of their femininity or anything overly feminine to fit into a system that runs on the idea that being feminine is maybe being vain or superficial and not being serious about science? What do you feel? So this is really interesting about how women in science are under the pressure of performing a certain kind of femininity, okay, which is not the culturally accepted notion of femininity, right? Because if you are in science, then you're supposed to strip yourself of those things which are feminine, which are culturally associated with feminine, and you have to adopt all that performance which is culturally associated with the masculine, right? Don the pants on, basically, yeah, and be aggressive and do this, because otherwise you're not good enough, yeah. So you see a lot of women in science in India do some very interesting things. Now, one is, of course, they will be very careful to see that they will adopt an ascetic model of dressing, okay. Apart from that, you will see an exaggerated underlining of femininity. Okay, you see simultaneously various kinds of interesting things going on. So the married science woman will wear the Mangal Sutra double, will almost sometimes wear this and wear, Shaka Pola this. I mean, you tend to see it in some spaces more than others, I agree. But there is an underlying desire to say, I am woman, because when she goes outside, quote unquote, of the world of science, also, she needs to sort of keep underlining that just because she's a scientist, that doesn't mean that cancels her womanhood. But Anushka, I want to point out just one small other thing, that deeply internalized notions of femininity, which women themselves carry. Okay, so this whole idea of motherhood, that I am not complete till I am a mother. Okay, the kind of crises, I mean, that women go through to prove their femininity to themselves more than to anybody else. And I'll tell you a very painful narrative of somebody who was in science, in mathematics. You know how careers in science are, they take so long to get stabilized. When do you start having a baby? What about the biological clock, etc., etc.? But this person went through from the age of 32 or 33 to the age of 42, 8 miscarriages. And I've said this before, it's one of the studies interviews, to just have that biological child. And there is absolutely no explanation except that she has internalized a culturally accepted notion of womanhood, saying that she will complete herself only if she becomes a mother, and that becomes doubly underlined for a woman in science. Yeah. But on this question of implicit bias, if I may say so, I think it's not always true, Sucheta and Maya, what you will say. It is, implicit bias is there among men when they discriminate. But I think it's much deeper. I think it's power. Okay, it is structures of power. Very often men know exactly what they're doing. It's not implicit bias. They know they are active agents of discrimination. When you have cases of sexual harassment, when you have cases of, like Raman's narrative of Kamala Soni, this is not implicit bias.
Yes, absolutely. I agree.
This
Yes.
is absolutely deep-rooted structures of patriarchy which are there, and men often have the clean chit to go with it. Yeah. So these have to be destabilized and challenged very, very vibrantly. Yeah. So now, Rupkatha, if you don't mind, can I finish my round of the answers?
Ma'am, Dr. Vaidya, I think also has a question for you, I
Yes.
guess.
Uh,
Yes.
I
Ma'am, can
lost
you
it.
see the question? Should I read it out to you?
Here it
I'll
is.
just read it out for the audience.
Yes,
So, when
please.
it comes to opening up a field and discipline to critique, and also the possibility that structures really require closer examination, it turns out that the onus often ends up, once again, not on the shoulders of those who may find themselves marginalized. Oh,
On
this
the
raises
show.
a critical point on the shoulders. Yeah, that's just. This raises the critical point of where will this critique, in particular, that involving the practitioners of science themselves will come from. It might be rather unfair if that onus is again placed on those who are being, in any case, pushed out by dominant structures. And she wants Dr. Chatta to comment, but all of you, please follow her. Yeah.
Yeah. So Vidita has raised a very important point, and I think I'm sure Nandita has also something to say to this. And Vidita, I actually agree with you that if we put the onus of critiquing, so for example, if we are looking at research designs and we are trying to look at how research designs might import a bias, right? By probably only looking at male samples or probably only using a certain kind of language, whatever. Yeah. Now, that needs to be changed. Now, if you put the onus of the critique only on those who are marginalized, their burden increases. Any university situation you see, if you are a woman, then the women's development cell work will come on you, the mentoring work will come on you, then your own discipline you have to bend from feminist or women's perspective, that also falls on you. Burden of a woman in academia becomes huge. Now, having said this, the point is sometimes the best insights into what is wrong with the picture come from those who are marginalized. And we must not lose that opportunity that if we are marginalized and if we are detecting bias, then in a way it is our moral responsibility and almost comes with an urgency to do that from our marginal locations. But having said that, we do need to get an ally culture into science. You need your allies. Yeah. You need people who might not be from that marginalized location, but who will empathetically listen to you. So, for example, if I am a Savarna woman, but I know that my postdoc or my student is a Dalit. Yeah, it is up in a way up to me to become an ally of that marginal location and listen to that more intensely. Same applies for men. If men begin to recognize what this masculine culture is doing to them and to women around them, and they work as allies, then you can definitely shift the discourse, is what I'd say. So I don't know, Vidita, whether that answers your question, but honestly, the best critique will come from our marginal locations, but we need to also develop the ally cultures. I don't know whether that answers you.
Nandita, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just like to read one small excerpt from a piece on the life of science. So this is basically a conversation between two research scholars, Shalini Mahadev and Vaishali Khandekar. Shalini is a Dalit person. Actually, both of them are Dalit, and they were having a conversation about being Dalit people in the world of science and what that is like. And there's one really hard-hitting exchange that they have, which I wanted to read out, which I thought
Yes,
was
please.
relevant to what Vidita's question is, and maybe we can just think about it and make of it what we will. So Shalini says, a friend of mine told me once that when we go in their space and give a talk, we become their subjects. They will always look at us in a setting where we are subjects from whom knowledge has to be gathered, but we ourselves do not have much knowledge. We should sit and study them instead. But who would fund such a study anyway? And Vaishali replies, it's so true. Especially in the social sciences, any study on caste readily translates into incessantly researching Dalits. Even now, it is you and I who are talking about being Dalit and a woman. I haven't really seen it, but I want to see how two Brahmin women in academia will talk about caste. Maybe about how being a Brahmin has benefited them in academic spaces and how Brahminical patriarchy has affected their growth. I feel there are so many interesting questions to deal with in the world of upper castes. So, yeah.
Yes, that brings a very different kind of perspective to this discussion. So, any of our panelists, do you want to respond to Nandita or what Nandita just read out?
If I have to add a comment, like initially when Nandita was speaking, she said it's all about passing on the mic to them, right? So expressing and understanding what they're going through. They're the best people who can talk about what they're going through, right? And to connect it to how everyone else can be allies. The first thing that you have to express as being an ally is like what Geeta said, listening to them, understanding from where they're coming from, and put yourself in their shoes, right? Along with that, it's also very important to acknowledge your privilege, if I may call that so, right? So, and like, say that, okay, I'm happy about it. I know that, there were a lot of other factors that made me come here and be what I am today for whatever it is. And how am I going to put forth or put that forward, this particular privilege or whatever advantages I have gotten, to people around me who don't have that privilege, or how I can be supportive of them and take that as an advantage to be a stronger support for them. Do you have something to comment, Nandita or Geeta? What do you think?
I mean, when you were speaking, I was also agreeing with you, and then it also struck me how we are saying they, and again we are sort of talking about them,
Yes.
and I don't know if they are in this room or they're part of this conversation, but that is something that to acknowledge and just be humbled by.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Nandita Sucheta that we need to also, whom do we use the we for? It's not easy. Like I was saying in my presentation also, it's much easier for privileged people on one, but discriminated on one axis to be able to talk about discrimination. Okay, but it's much harder to talk about privilege, and it's much harder to give up privilege. So if you want to genuinely build an ally culture, you want to genuinely build solidarities, you have to be able to give up privilege, right? And so the ally culture takes or the culture of being allies is something which is a very deeply transformative process, where we also learn to decentralize ourselves. We also learn to see how we ourselves are deeply conditioned. Yeah. And so the question is, who is this we need, all of us need to together think about this. Yeah. And but I honestly think that our critique should be much more hard hitting than I want to know what you feel about the bias idea. Do you think it's sometimes
My
I think
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes.
much.
Implicit bias is the hidden one, that you may not know you have, but
Yeah.
absolutely there is power at play.
Yeah,
And
they know what they have.
yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So I think we need to be a little more Not just use the thing about implicit bias, because there are active cases of use of power, right, in the
Yes.
academics. We must be very, very careful on letting them go off with implicit bias.
Yeah.
Just a way of saying something.
Yeah.
So, Maya, a question for you that it's come from Shoradeep, who's a team member. He wants to know that can you enlighten us all a bit about the science and the administration policies that can provide an academic climate that is conducive to women or non-binary scientists? Do policies like the Athena Swan Charter do they add to creating a more equitable climate in science, in academia?
Okay, so I don't know enough about this charter to actually answer that specific question. But I mean, the larger question is, I wish I knew. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that one would want to hire more women and do so actively, you know, that would make a huge difference. And I mean, I see it at Ashoka, for example. We have so many women students who are studying computer science. And they ask, I mean, they articulate this desire to have female faculty, but there aren't any. And maybe we should try a little harder to get one. I think that if we decided, if an institution decides that the next hire in computer science or physics or math is going to be a woman, they could probably swing it. You know, I guess I don't know about policy. I'm speaking more about the will to do it, which would come first. And maybe some, like, if you have the will to do it, then, you know, you would ask questions, you would be curious about why certain things are not working, why are women not applying, why is the composition of the mathematics classroom slowly shifting and becoming more male over a period of 5 years. You know, you have to, it's the will rather than the policy that has to come first. This is what I think.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I answered the question, but yeah.
Yes. So Nandita, I think, has to go. So I would ask for some concluding remarks. I'll go around, but I'll start off with her because she has to go. Yeah, please, Nandita.
Yeah. I mean, maybe one of the questions Rupkata had asked me to talk about was my experience of being a woman in the world of science and academia, and just, you know, if trusting that there are young people in science in the audience, I just wanted to say that for me, it's been really great to be a woman in this space, thanks to the other women who've been part of this journey with me. And I was lucky enough that I had, you know, predominantly science teachers in school, and I guess now that I think about it, fortunately, I didn't get into the really good science institute, so I got into the very not so great ones. But the bright side of that is the gender gap was much more narrow there. There were a lot more women in these places, so I think it was a blessing in disguise, because I don't know. I don't know what I would have done if I had found myself in an IIT, which is so completely skewed. And yeah, so I mean, you know, it's a great place to be, and there are some amazing people, especially women, who are so brave and doing so well. And it's like, at least in my job, I end up being in spaces with a lot of really inspiring people around me. So it's I mean, it can be an amazing place, but also don't feel bad about all the challenges, and find people that, you know, you can speak to and who are open about this. So good luck to everyone.
That was wonderful.
Thanks a lot to Biologically Speaking and Vice
It's been
Podcast.
amazing talking to you. And
Thank
I'll go around for the concluding remarks with Nandita. Thank you so much. And you have a busy schedule. I think Women's Day coming up. So, but you found the time and you devoted us to us. I think we had a. Did we have a good time? I had a great time listening to you all. So, Suchita, uh, concluding remarks.
Uh,
And
did,
how do
did
you
you,
tie it all up?
sorry,
Can
I
you
was
hear me?
off.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
All right. Okay.
yeah.
Yes, indeed. I'd also like to conclude on the brighter side, where I want to say that it's things are changing, but there's a lot more to do, a lot more to a long way forward, and also it's important to be a little more aware of how you are having that bias towards a particular gender or any intersection of bias that you're looking at, and also see how especially I want women or young girls to think about how you shouldn't be losing your heart, and be more optimistic and be strong enough to actually pursue your career, not just in science but with whatever you're interested in. Yeah.
Thanks, Suchita. Geeta, if you could just, yeah, to all the young people, women, and all the people from marginalized groups, trans people who are trying to do science today, Geeta and Maya, what is it that you're going to tell them? And
I
yes,
just genuinely believe that hope lies with them or whom I don't want, again, I don't know how to use language of not us in there, but it's the hope lies with people who are from gender non-conforming locations, trans women, trans men, who comes from girls, from marginalized groups. Hope comes from there because, I genuinely think that marginality gives us an urgency, okay, an urgency to take some things on, speak truth to power. And if there can be a solidarity culture within science, because science is a very individuated culture. Now, everything depends on individuals. So if we can move towards a more culture of solidarity, uh, because marginalities can often divide us, right? They can put us into boxes. We can say, oh, I belong to this, I belong to this, I belong. So the intersectionality approach would be to be able to see across intersections. And my hope would be there, but my hope would be not just to make the community inclusive, but my hope would be for that inclusive community, that community to bring a critical consciousness to bear upon the kind of science we are doing and producing in modernity. Is this a kind of science we want? Is this a kind of destructive, instrumentalist, utilitarian kind of science that we want? Or can we think of another vision? Yeah. So to be able to critique Darwin's evolutionism and say, why was hunting and competition the principle which was privileged in that theory and not cooperation? That was also and food gathering, because those were also things that were crucial to species survival. So I think my hope lies with all of you.
I just
Maya,
want to add, yeah, I want to add one thing, and also this response to an earlier question, is it too much to put the onus of like change on the shoulders of people who are at the receiving end of the who have already have the short end of the stick? Well, I feel they are the only ones who are going to change it. So I don't know, there's no other way. And I want to add one thing.
That's not to say, Maya, right, that the others have to be absorbed. That's not to say that.
No, correct. It's not to say, and
Exactly.
I mean, there is this transformative power of solidarity, and that's a powerful idea. And I want to add, I'm in my 40s, and my peers who I went to college with, my friends, whether they're filmmakers or lawyers or academics or my colleagues, have this idea that these young people are entitled, the millennials. They, they, and I think there's something wonderful about that. Be entitled, and let it be unimaginable that you should not have a voice. And so be entitled.
Let it be unimaginable that you should not have a voice. Yes, I mean, we at Biologically Speaking, we are new. This is the first conference we're doing. Hopefully, we will be a platform who can give voices to those people in science who haven't had a voice till now, and interacting with all of you today on the eve of International Women's Day. It has been a privilege and an absolute honor. Dr. Chadda, Dr. Saran, Suchita, I'm sorry I called you by first names. I'm really sorry. And
you should, because we have to move towards more non-hierarchical.
Exactly.
Yes, non-hierarchical. Yes, that's what we end on.
Yes.
Non-hierarchical, inclusive, and equitable world of science. Just like the world outside, the world of science it's part of the society that we are in. So if you want a more equitable society, I guess we want a more equitable world in science. So I guess that's the note we're going to end on. It's been an amazing 2 hours. Happy International Women's Day to all our viewers. And please check out the links that our panelists have shared with you. Please check out Biologically Speaking's website. Hopefully, we'll have many more events coming up. And hopefully, we'll be having you all again here with us someday in some other event. So it's been amazing. It's been amazing, really. And thank you so much, all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you, our viewers who are watching. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupkatha.
Bye-bye, Rupkatha. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.